This is part 2 in the Chapter 4 lesson from Photoshop Classroom in a Book. I'm picking up at the section in the chapter that says dragging to add a new layer. Now I'll tell you that in all the years I've used Photoshop, I've never placed an image into a document using this method. And the reason is that I prefer to work with my application maximized so that I'm not distracted by the things that might be on my desktop. I like to have the full real estate of my monitor used by Photoshop. This method of dragging to add a new layer requires you to minimize your application frame. I'm going to show you the way that I would do this instead. I would go to File, Place Embedded, and then navigate to the location of the image that I want. In this case it's Flower 2. So I will select that and say Place. Now it placed it right above the cloud layer because that's the layer that I had active. So I'm going to go ahead and commit this place. See, we have handles around it at this point. I'm going to commit it by clicking the big check up here, and then I'm just going to move this above the pineapple so that we can see it. Then I can drag it using my move tool, which I currently have active. I can just drag this down into position. So in my opinion, this is a much better way to place an image into an existing document. Okay, I'm ready to add the text now, and I can easily jump to the text tool by typing in the T on my keyboard, which will jump from the move tool to the text tool. And the book has us use a font called Birch. If I click on this drop down, you'll see I have a lot of fonts installed on my computer, but if I highlight the Helvetica Neue, which is currently active, and type in Birch, it'll do that search for me and find the font. You may or may not have the font Birch installed on your computer, and it's really kind of irrelevant if you do or you don't. Now the next tip is that the book tells you to go to the menu to find the character panel up here under Window. But you don't need to do that because while you're in the text tool, you have an options bar up here, and this icon on the end brings up the character panel for you. So from here you can fill out all of the specific information that the book requires. I'm going to pause here and fill this stuff out and then come back. Okay, I've set my text for Island Paradise and placed it into position under Hawaii. I've also set my foreground and background color according to the directions in the book. Now, this is worth repeating here. Hawaii is a word and it has letters, but it is not text. It's not a font. If you look at the layers, Island Paradise has a big T. That tells us that that's a text layer. Hawaii is just pixels. It's just artwork in the shape of letters. And there's a big difference between a text layer and a picture of letters because we can't say fix the spelling. If Hawaii was spelled wrong, we wouldn't be able to fix that by just typing into it because there is no font there to type into. I'm on the Move tool. I'm going to switch to the Gradient tool with the G on my keyboard. Now the Gradient tool is active and we have new options up here on our options bar. Before I go any further, I want to make sure that I have the correct layer selected, so I'm going to click on Hawaii so it's selected. Now let's take a look underneath this option here where we see the orange to transparent. These first two chips are always the foreground and the background color. This first one will always be foreground background color, and the second one will be foreground to transparent. We're going to use the option foreground to background color. The book has us make an active selection of the Hawaii letters before we apply the gradient. Now this tip for creating a selection from the transparency of a layer is a very, very handy one, and if you learn it now you'll find lots of uses for it in the future. So if I hold my command key down because I'm on a Mac, when I click on Hawaii I'll get an active selection of the pixels in that layer. I'm going to do a command D to deselect. If If I was using a PC, that would be a control key instead of a command key. So again, command or control. Notice that my cursor icon changes when I hold down the command key. It looks like a pointed index finger with the marching ants marquee. And this tells me that if I click, it's going to load to a selection. Now if I go up here to where the flower is and I click here, it loaded the flower into an active selection. Even though I had the Hawaii layer active, I can click on any of these. We'll go down to this beach scene and now it becomes an active selection. So this is a very, very handy way of taking the transparency of a layer and turning it into an active selection. So let's go ahead and select Hawaii and then take our gradient and fill this the way that the book tells us to do so. I'm going to use the history panel here to step back to before I did the gradient. We'll go one back from there because there's always multiple ways to do the same thing in Photoshop, and I want to show you a way that doesn't require having an active selection. I'm going to do a Command D or Control D to turn off the active selection, and then I'm going to go up to the top of the layer panel here. You see the word lock and there's several icons next to it. This first icon will lock the transparency. If I turn on the lock for the transparency, you'll see a lock show up on the right side of this layer. And if I try to paint right now, let me get a smaller brush here, set it to 100%. If I try and paint out here, it won't paint at all. But as I come across where the pixels exist, it will paint in those areas. So the lock, the transparency, is like having an active selection, only you don't need to have an active selection. So I'm going to do a Command Z, go back to my gradient tool, and then drag out the gradient. So I was able to accomplish the same exact thing without having an active selection. The book has you add a layer style by finding it from the menu. I prefer to just go to the bottom of the layer panel where you see the FX. All the layer styles are located under there. So I'll click on the FX and then select drop shadow. Now the other cool thing about this, it's not shown in the book, is that you can actually click in your image to move the shadow. I'm going to take the opacity of my shadow up so that we can see it better in this recording. If I click in the image, I can actually manually drag that shadow around, and that's a really nice effect, a nice easy way to work. Layer styles are a lot of fun. There's all kinds of cool and creative things you can do with them. So follow the directions in the book and play around with them on your own and see what you get. When you're ready to copy a layer style, or if you want to take a shadow and apply it to multiple layers, as the book says, you hold your Option or your Alt key down and click on the effect, and as you drag, be looking for that double arrow that you see here, the black and the white arrow. That's telling me that as I drag that effect, it's making a copy of it. So I'm going to drag it down to Island Paradise and let go, and now the Island Paradise text has the same shadow as the Hawaii text. I'm going to do a Command Z to undo that and show you what happens without the Alt or the Option key. I'll just grab the effect and drag it down to Island Paradise, and it simply moved the shadow from the Hawaii layer to the Island Paradise layer. I've jumped forward to the section that says adding an adjustment layer. I've added the hue saturation layer as required in the book, and I've dialed in the values that it calls for. If I turn the visibility on and off on this hue saturation layer, you'll see that it's affecting the colors of all the layers that lay below this hue saturation layer. If I moved this layer up to the very top of my stacking priority, it would affect all the layers in the composition, everything that falls below it. So I'm going to move it back down so that it's just above this flower too. Now the book has you make a clipping mask out of it, and when you turn this into a clipping, what it does is this hue saturation color only gets applied to the pixels of the layer immediately below it. It's like it takes the transparency of this and masks it. So the book tells you to do it with a control click or a right click, and then let's see, I need to scroll this up so we can see it. Do a control click and then pick Create Clipping Mask from the pop-up menu. You can also get there with a keyboard shortcut by holding the Option or the Alt key down and hovering right where the layers meet. You see the icon changes to that downward arrow with the square. If I click right there, the whole thing shifted to the right. We see this arrow here, and now it's being clipped by the flower below, and the hue saturation is only changing the color of the flower and not the pineapple and clouds below it. The rest of this chapter is pretty straightforward, so you can follow that on your own time and go through all the steps that I didn't cover in this video. I do want to talk a little bit about the last section though that says flattening and saving your files. The only time I flatten all of these layers is when I'm going to send something to a printer and I don't want them to have the ability to mess with the layers of my layout. So in that case, I would flatten the file and send them a flattened version. But otherwise, I'd never ever do that because you always want to be able to come back and make changes if necessary. And also, all of the projects that you turn in for this course, you need to turn in a file with all of the layers intact. So don't get in the habit of flattening your files anytime soon.